The waiter did not stumble. I watched the three of them lift their crystal flutes in perfect rhythm and pour cold champagne straight down onto the black dog sleeping at the Mafia Boss's feet. The bubbles hit Rook's blind eyes first, then his muzzle, then the silver harness that guided him through a world he could no longer see. He didn't yelp. He froze. His shoulders locked, his nostrils flared, and his whole body began to tremble against the marble floor of the Copley Grand Ballroom. Every conversation in that gilded room kept moving as if nothing had happened. I dropped to my knees in the puddle before I remembered the dress I was wearing cost more than my monthly rent. I pressed my palm flat under Rook's throat, felt his pulse hammering there like a trapped bird, and whispered the only thing I could think of. "I'm here. I'm here, breathe with me." That was when Marcello Vieri leaned forward in his chair, laid one long finger against his son's godfather's wrist, and said very quietly, "Lock the doors." The ballroom's tall bronze doors sealed with a soft metallic click that everyone pretended not to hear. 200 of Boston's richest guests kept smiling over their salmon and champagne, but the temperature in the room had already changed. I did not look up. I kept my hands on Rook's throat and my forehead close to his because his blind eyes were rolling, and I could feel him losing his grip on the world. If you have ever watched a dog panic in the dark, you know it isn't loud. It is small and terrible and private, and it happens under the noise of a laughing crowd. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed too brightly at a joke nobody had told, and a captain in a dark suit slid quietly along the wall to stand between me and the nearest exit. Please, if this opening already has your heart in your throat, tap that like button right now and follow along, because what I learned in the next 4 minutes rewrote everything I thought I knew about who the real predators in that room were. My name is Marla Whitcomb. I am 29 years old. I run a small canine rehabilitation clinic out of a converted boat shed in Newburyport, and I had absolutely no business being at a $100,000 a plate charity gala in downtown Boston. I was there because a wealthy client had bought a table, canceled at the last minute, and passed her seat to the dog lady as a favor. I wore my late mother's borrowed emerald dress, the one with the small scorch mark on the hem I had covered with a length of matching ribbon. I had one glass of water in my hand. I was trying very hard not to knock anything over. And then, halfway through the second course, the room's mood had shifted around a black Cane Corso lying beside a silver-haired man I had recognized from the newspapers. Marcello Vieri, widower, 53, rumored head of the oldest Italian family in New England. And the reason nobody at his table was allowed to spill anything by accident, except 3 men at the next table just had. On purpose. In perfect coordination. I watched them do it, and I watched them smile at each other afterward, the small, congratulatory smile of men who believe they have executed the difficult part of a longer plan. Marcello did not shout. He did not stand. He turned his head 1/4 of an inch toward the men and said, "Nobody leaves this room until my dog can breathe again." His voice was so calm it sounded almost gentle, and that was the thing that terrified the waiters more than any shouting could have. A tall man in a black suit stepped away from the wall and moved to each exit like he was closing a museum for the night. I could feel my heartbeat in the tips of my fingers. I kept working on Rook. I opened the folded silk napkin from my lap, blotted the champagne off his muzzle, and pressed my thumbs gently along the soft indentations behind his ears to bring his focus back to touch instead of smell. After a long minute, his ribs rose and fell in a slower rhythm, and one heavy paw slid across the marble to rest on my knee. That was when I felt the whole room watching me. "Miss." The voice above me was low and unhurried. I looked up into a lean face carved by grief and long nights. "What did they do to him?" Marcello asked. Not what did they spill, what did they do? Even then, on my knees on that soaked floor, I understood he already knew this was not a prank. "The champagne isn't the injury," I said carefully. "It's the smell. He's blind, isn't he? He's been navigating this whole ballroom by scent, and someone just poured a bottle of the strongest fragrance in the room straight onto his nose. Whatever he was tracking, he can't track anymore." Marcello's eyes went very still. He nodded once and said, "Explain that to me again in the car." 10 minutes later, I was riding through a sleeting Boston night in a black armored sedan, with a blind cane corso panting quietly against my thigh, and a mafia patriarch across from me who had not yet decided whether I was a guest or a witness. Behind us, in a locked ballroom I would never see the inside of again, 3 men in tuxedos were being politely questioned by people who did not have police badges. I did not know yet that the champagne had never been about humiliating Rook. It had been about blinding him a second time. Someone at that gala had been terrified of what this dog could still smell, and the champagne, poured in perfect coordination by 3 strangers, had been the loudest possible way to make sure the dog's warning would not be believed, even if he tried to give it. Marcello did not speak much on that ride. He watched Rook. He watched the black Boston streets slide past the tinted windows. Once, when the car braked for an ambulance, he laid one hand very lightly on the dog's shoulder, and Rook, without lifting his head, pushed his blind face into that hand with the private, wordless trust animals give to one person and one person only. I looked away because it felt like reading somebody's mail. When we passed the last streetlight before the toll bridge, Marcello finally spoke. He said, "Miss Whitcomb, I have to ask you something and you are going to think it is strange. Do you have any family? Anyone who would notice if you did not come home this weekend?" I told him about my grandmother in Newburyport. He nodded once. He said, "A car will be parked outside her house within the hour. You will not see it. It will not bother her. It will simply be there." I did not understand yet what I had walked into. I only understood that the man across from me had already decided a stranger was worth protecting, and that decision had happened somewhere between a soaked ballroom floor and a locked bronze door. The Vieira estate sat behind a stone wall in the town of Manchester by the Sea, an hour up the coast from Boston, and looked less like a mansion than a monastery that had been decorated by someone who could afford the sea. Marcello did not offer me a tour. He walked me straight to a low room off the kitchen where Rook slept on a heated mat, and he asked, in the same quiet voice he had used at the gala, if I would come back the following morning. "Rook trusted you in 3 minutes," he said. "He has not trusted a stranger in 7 years. I need to understand why." He offered me a fee that made my hands go cold in my coat pockets. I said yes because of the dog, and I told myself that twice on the drive home. My grandmother Dolores was still awake when I got back to Newburyport. She listened to my whole story from her armchair, tapping one slippered foot, and when I finished, she said, "Marla, honey, if a man like that hires you for a dog, the dog is the smallest thing on his mind." I laughed at her. I should not have. For the first week at the estate, I only worked with Rook. I mapped the corners he refused to approach and the doorways where he lifted his nose and searched for something he could not name. I logged his heart rate against his pacing, noted which rugs he trusted and which he would step around, and slowly I built the invisible map every blind working dog carries in his head. Marcello watched us for an hour every morning and left. He did not sit in a corner making phone calls. He knelt on the tile with Rook's head against his chest and murmured to him in a low voice, mostly in English, sometimes in Italian, and I began to understand that this quiet man had lost more than a wife 6 years ago. He had lost the person who had chosen this puppy from a litter in the last months of her life. Rook was not a status symbol. Rook was the only living thing left in that house that his late wife had touched. Small things about Marcello began to reorganize what I thought I knew about men like him. He remembered, without being told, that I preferred my tea without sugar. He walked his 80-year-old mother, Ottavia, from the sunroom to the dining table every evening himself, instead of letting a servant hurry her. He stopped a captain, mid-sentence, from calling a young housekeeper by an ugly name, and he did it without raising his voice, the way another man might correct a child's grammar. He noticed on the 3rd afternoon that I flinched near the lilies on the entry table, and by evening they were gone, and no one in the household ever mentioned it. When my grandmother Dolores came to visit that first weekend, sitting stiffly on the edge of a velvet chair with her handbag in her lap, he sat across from her for 20 minutes and asked her about the boats her late husband had built in the Newburyport yard. He listened. He remembered names. She squeezed my wrist on her way out and said softly, "Whatever this is, Marla, be careful. That is a lonely man." I did not answer her because I was already afraid she was right. On the 5th morning I noticed something small. Rook stopped in the corridor outside the library and lifted his nose the same way he had at the gala. He pressed his shoulder against my leg and would not walk forward. I told Marcello. He asked me to show him exactly where. He stood in that corridor for a long time, running his eyes across the wallpaper and the sconces, and then said, "Nothing has been moved here in 4 years." He did not sound surprised. He sounded like a man confirming something he had already begun to suspect. I asked him what he thought Rook was smelling. He answered without turning his head. "Someone who does not belong on this floor." His sister, Serafina Vieri, arrived the following weekend, and my quiet apprenticeship ended. Serafina was 46, elegant, widowed young, and she had raised Marcello's teenage nephew almost single-handedly after her husband's death. She kissed her brother on both cheeks, ignored Rook, and looked at me the way a hostess looks at a chipped plate. Within 20 minutes, she had reminded me twice that dog trainers were usually paid through the household office. Within an hour, she had asked, without asking, whether I understood how many women had tried to interest themselves in her lonely, widowed brother. I answered by asking her when Rook had last had his teeth cleaned. She smiled thinly and said, "You will not last, dear, but please try." That was the first warning. If you're already sensing where this is going, hit subscribe now, because the traps are about to start, and one of them nearly cost me my life. The first trap came on a Wednesday. I always drew Rook's evening medication myself from the sealed bottle in the pantry cabinet, and I always checked the manufacturer's imprint on the pill, because a rehabilitation specialist who has lost a dog to a mixed-up prescription never forgets it. That evening, the pill in my palm was one shade too pale, and the imprint was rotated by 90 degrees. My hand went still. I walked the pill back into the kitchen, laid it on a white plate next to the correct one from a fresh bottle, and asked Marcello to come and look. He looked for a long time. Then he asked, without raising his voice, who had access to that cabinet in the past 6 hours. The answer, everyone in that kitchen already knew, included his sister. Serafina walked in a moment later, saw the 2 pills on the plate, and did something I did not expect. She did not deny it. She said, "I wanted to see whether you were paying attention." Marcello did not answer her. He looked at me, and something in his eyes changed. Not softer, sharper. He had been quietly watching 2 things at once, and I had just failed the wrong test in the right way. That night, on my way back to the guest cottage, Rook stopped in the same corridor outside the library. He lifted his blind face and searched the air again. This time I noticed what I had missed before. Under the polish and the wood smoke from the drawing room fire, there was a thin, dry smell of cedar and something sharper. Cloves, maybe. Something old. I filed it away in the same corner of my mind where I keep the coats of dogs I have not yet met. I did not know then that a smell can be a signature. I would learn. The second trap came 10 days later, and it was crueler. Serafina laid out a small velvet tray of her late sister-in-law's jewelry on the library table for the family to choose keepsakes from, and when I passed the door on my way to Rook's evening walk, a single sapphire earring somehow slipped into the cuff of my sleeve. I did not notice it until I felt the cold metal against my wrist an hour later on the seawall. I walked straight back into the house. I did not knock on Marcello's study door. I walked to the drawing room where his 80-year-old mother, Ottavia, was sitting with her tea, laid the earring in her open palm and said, "This came home with me by mistake. It belongs with your daughter-in-law's things, not mine." Ottavia looked at me for a long, weightless moment. Then she closed her fingers over the earring and said, "Thank you, dear. Sit with me a minute." I sat. She did not speak again for the length of that tea, but her eyes never left the doorway, as if she were waiting to see who came through it looking for a missing jewel. Serafina came through it 11 minutes later. She saw the earring in her mother's hand. Her face did the smallest possible thing, and then she smiled and said she had been searching for that all afternoon. Ottavia said nothing. Later that night, Marcello found me at the kennel with Rook. He stood in the doorway for a while before he spoke. Then he said, "My mother told me what you did with the earring." I nodded. He said, "Serafina did not put that in your sleeve alone." I looked up. He was not asking me, he was telling me. "Someone is feeding my sister ideas," he said quietly. that she could not have had on her own. And whoever it is wants you gone from this house, which means I need to know why you matter to them before I know why you matter to me. He did not step into the light. He did not touch me. But that was the moment my heart did the thing hearts do when they realize they have already crossed a line they were pretending not to see. We began the deception the next morning. Marcello and I decided, over black coffee in his study before dawn, that from that day forward the household would watch our friendship curdle. He would grow colder. I would grow quieter. Serafina would keep laying traps, and whoever was whispering behind her shoulder would grow bolder. Because a boss who has turned against his tender-hearted dog woman is a boss who has been isolated. It was the only way to make the invisible person visible. We shook hands across his desk like two strangers agreeing to a contract. His hand was warm. Mine was not. I told myself it was a job. I did not believe me. Before I left the study, he said one more thing, so quietly I almost missed it. He said, "When this is over, Marla, I will tell you the difference between the man I have to be and the man I am. I would like you to still be in this house when I do." I did not answer. I could not. Publicly, the change was immediate. He stopped joining our morning sessions. He stopped asking me to eat with the family. When we crossed in a hallway, he barely lifted his eyes. Serafina noticed within a week. She began to smile at me in a way I had not seen before, small and pleased, and she began to leave doors open near me that had previously been closed. That was when I began to see the shape of the person behind her. She was not inventing these ideas, she was receiving them. Her phone chimed too often for a woman with no daytime friends. Her walks in the walled garden lasted exactly the length of a long phone call. And once, when I turned a corner faster than she expected, I heard her say into the receiver, "I don't care what he trusted her with. I want her out of this house by the end of the month." And then, in a smaller voice, "Yes, I understand. I will wait for your next instruction." Her eyes met mine over the phone. She did not flinch. Neither did I. I began keeping a small notebook in the pocket of my work coat. I wrote down every time she took a call, every place she took it, and every corridor Rook refused to walk. I wrote down which captains she smiled at longer than the others, and which servants she stopped speaking around. By the end of that week, the notebook had a shape to it. Someone very close to this family had built a slow, patient siege. Serafina was not the general. She was the front line. And whoever was drawing the map had walked the halls of this house long before I ever set foot on them. Ottavia found me in the kennel one afternoon while I was brushing Rook. She sat down on the wooden bench with the slow care of a woman whose knees no longer forgave her, folded her hands in her lap, and watched me work for a long minute without speaking. Then she said, "My daughter is not a cruel woman, Marla. She is a frightened one. She lost her husband when her boy was 4. She has watched my son lose a wife and refused to look at another woman for 6 years. She is not trying to hurt you. She is trying to hold what is left of her family together with both hands, and someone has taken advantage of those hands." I did not answer right away. I set the brush down. I said, "Signora, whoever is using her is not going to stop with me." Ottavia looked at Rook. She said, "I know. That is why I am telling you. When the moment comes, and it will come, I will stand in the room where my son needs me to stand, not where Serafina wants me to stand." She patted my wrist once with a hand as thin as writing paper, and she left the kennel without another word. I never told Marcello about that conversation. I did not need to. Ottavia kept her promise the night everything ended, and she kept it standing exactly where she said she would. The third incident was designed to finish me. A confidential family document, a codicil to Marcello's will drafted after his wife's death, appeared as an unopened attachment in the shared work tablet I used to log Rook's medications. Anyone glancing at the tablet's history would see that I had received it. Anyone paranoid would assume I had opened it. Serafina made sure the household paranoia knew where to look. That evening, at a family dinner I was not supposed to attend, Marcello asked me into the dining room in front of his captains and said, in a voice cold enough to strip paint, "Did you open the file on the tablet, Marla?" I said no. He said, "I do not believe you." He said it while looking at his sister. He said it while his mother's hands went still on her napkin. He said it because he had to. I stood up. I laid the tablet on the table. I said, "Then I will leave in the morning." Rook, at his feet, lifted his head and gave a low, confused sound. I did not look back. I walked out through the door his sister had left open for me. I did not go far. I did not go home. I drove 12 miles north to a small motel Marcello's security chief, Dante Russo, had booked in a false name. And for the next 9 days, I lived out of one suitcase and coordinated with Dante over an encrypted line, while the Vieri house believed I was gone. Rook stayed with me. His absence was the thing Marcello could not fake, because everyone in the household knew that dog followed him like a shadow. So we let the household believe the dog had left with the woman his boss had thrown out. Serafina made sure the rumor traveled. Whoever was directing her wanted Rook out of that house almost as badly as they wanted me out, and now they had both. I read the meaning of that in Dante's face when he handed me the report. Somebody was terrified of the dog's nose, and I was beginning to understand why. Before we go into the last third of this story, if you have been holding your breath, do me a small favor and drop one word in the comments right now. Tell me who you already suspect is really behind Serafina, because I promise you the answer is not going to be who you think. The motel was small, cold, and honest in the way small, honest places are. I slept badly. Rook slept worse. On the second night, he sat up on the thin carpet, pointed his blind face at the door, and did not settle again until Dante's car pulled into the lot at 4 in the morning with a printed list of numbers. On the third night, at 2, my grandmother Dolores called me from Newburyport and said, "There is a man outside my house pretending to read a newspaper in the dark. Should I be worried?" I told her yes. Dante had a car in her driveway within 20 minutes. My grandmother made the man a cup of coffee and told him where the bathroom was. She always did have a soft spot for hard-looking young men. She also, without knowing it, gave me the last piece of information I needed. Whoever was directing Serafina had begun to reach outside the walls of the Vieri estate, into a small coastal town he should have had no reason to know about, which meant he had been watching me longer than I had been watching him. Dante brought me a laptop on the 4th morning and set it on the little motel table between the coffee maker and the folded map of the harbor. He said, "Miss Whitcomb, before we go any further, the boss wants you to see something." He pressed a key. A grainy security recording began to play. It was from the ballroom the night of the gala, filmed by a camera Marcello's people had installed in the chandelier 6 months earlier, without the venue's knowledge. The camera showed the 3 men at the next table clearly. It also showed something I had not seen from my knees on the marble floor. Before the champagne was poured, an old man in a long cashmere coat had walked slowly along the wall behind them, paused, laid one gloved hand on the shoulder of the tallest of the 3, and moved on without stopping. The old man's face never turned toward the camera. His silver-headed cane tapped once against the marble. Rook, at Marcello's feet, lifted his blind head and turned it precisely toward the sound of that cane. Then the champagne came. I watched the moment 3 times. Dante watched me watching it. He said, "The boss noticed that cane 4 days ago, going back through the recording. He did not tell me whose it was until yesterday. He wanted you to see it from a room where nobody could read your face." I closed the laptop with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. I understood then that Marcello had already known who was behind everything, and had spent the last 2 weeks arranging his own home so that I could be the one to close the door on the man who had raised him. The whispers to Serafina escalated on the 4th day of my absence. Dante's people had quietly cloned her phone weeks earlier, and now the messages coming in were no longer about me. They were about Marcello's schedule, which drivers he trusted, which of his captains had lost a son to a rival family, and might be persuaded to blame that on Marcello's restraint, which corridors of the estate had blind spots in the winter light. Serafina answered some of the questions honestly. She hesitated on others. On the 7th day, the anonymous voice sent her a photograph of Marcello's teenage nephew, her only son, walking home alone from Boston Latin School through the Common. There was no caption. There did not need to be one. She sat in her walled garden that night and cried for a long time, and I watched the recording on Dante's laptop and felt something close to pity move under my anger. She was not the villain. She was a weapon that had been picked up long ago by someone who had waited years to swing it. On the 10th morning, we set the trap. Marcello sent word through his mother that he wished to reconcile with his sister and to formally end the search for the person who had, in his words, poisoned this family against a woman who did not deserve it. A dinner was called in the great dining room of the estate. Every senior captain would attend. Serafina would sit at her brother's right hand. Ottavia would preside. It would be, on the surface, the moment the family healed. Under the surface, it was the moment we opened the door and waited to see who walked through it. I came in the back way through the kitchen an hour before the guests arrived, with Rook padding silently beside me on a new harness. Dante had rerouted the estate's internal security to my tablet. Every door in the house could be sealed section by section from where I stood in the pantry off the great hall. Marcello did not look at me when I passed the dining room. That was the last piece of the performance. To anyone watching, the boss had not forgiven the dog woman. To the person watching most carefully of all, Marcello Vieri was alone at the head of his table, surrounded by captains he could no longer be sure of, with his sister beside him, and his mother across from him, and his blind dog nowhere in sight. It was, from the outside, the softest he had ever been. He arrived on foot from the guest wing, leaning on a silver-headed cane he did not need. Salvatore Corleone, 76 years old, godfather to Marcello since the day Marcello was baptized, the man who had held the child at his own father's funeral and taught the boy how to shave. Uncle Sal, the family called him. He walked into the dining room, kissed Ottavia on the forehead, laid one gentle hand on Serafina's cheek, and took his seat at Marcello's left. He was wearing a long, dark cashmere coat which he did not remove immediately, because the great hall in winter runs cold. He accepted a glass of red wine. He toasted the family, and in the pantry, 40 feet away, Rook lifted his head off my thigh and began to tremble. Cedar, and cloves, and something else underneath. Rook rose to his feet without a sound. He turned toward the dining room and pulled against the leash with the exact same tension he had shown in the ballroom corridor and beside the library door. I keyed the tablet twice. Dante's voice in my earpiece said, very softly, "We have him. Seal on your word." I whispered back, "Wait for the toast." Salvatore lifted his glass. He said in a warm voice that trembled with practiced emotion, "To my godson, who has carried more than any young man should carry, and who finally has the courage to let a good woman near his heart again, even after her betrayal has been forgiven." He looked at Serafina and she looked away. He looked at Marcello, and Marcello, without smiling, said, "Uncle Sal, where were you standing at the Copley Grand 2 months ago when the champagne was poured on Rook?" The old man's glass paused halfway to his mouth. It was the smallest possible pause. Marcello's eyes did not move. I keyed the tablet once. Every internal door in the estate sealed at the same time. The 3 men Salvatore had brought as his drivers were suddenly in 3 different corridors, cut off from each other and from him, and their sidearms became irrelevant against solid oak. 2 of Marcello's captains, the ones Dante had flagged as compromised, tried to rise from the table and found the dining room doors already locked from the outside. Ottavia set down her fork. Serafina put her face in her hands. Salvatore lowered his glass very carefully and said, "Marcello, whatever you think you know." And that was when I opened the pantry door and walked into the dining room with Rook on his harness. Rook did not hesitate. He crossed the marble floor with his blind head high, walked past his master, past Serafina, past Ottavia, straight to the chair where Salvatore Corleone was sitting, and pressed his nose flat against the hem of the old man's cashmere coat. Then he sat. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply sat, the way a working dog sits when a task is completed, and he leaned the full weight of his blind body against the coat of the man who had ordered the champagne poured on him at the Copley Grand. The room went very quiet. Marcello said, "You spent 40 years teaching me to notice everything." Salvatore's mouth moved, but nothing came out. Marcello continued, "You could not have expected me to stop noticing on the day it began to be you." Salvatore's hand went to his coat as though to shrug it off, and Serafina lifted her head from her hands and said, in a small, wrecked voice, "It was you on the phone. All of it. You told me she was hurting him. You told me the tablet, the earring, the medication. You told me my son was in danger. Salvatore did not look at her. He looked at Marcello. He said, "The family has grown soft. Your father would not recognize what you have made of it." Marcello said, "My father chose you as my godfather because he thought you loved us. If you had, this house would not need to be locked tonight." Dante's men brought Salvatore out through the kitchen because the front hall was, at that moment, still crowded with captains being separated one by one for questioning. He did not resist. Old men rarely do when the trap is already closed. Serafina stayed at the table with her face wet and her hands flat on the wood, and Ottavia reached across and covered her daughter's hand with her own without saying a word. That was the mercy of that night. Marcello did not humiliate his sister in front of his captains. He let her confess in her own time, in her own words, to her own mother. Then he stood, walked around the table to me, and stopped one step away. He said, "I am not going to thank you in front of these men." I said, "I am not asking you to." He said, "Stay. Not as an employee, not tonight, just stay." I opened my mouth to answer, and then Rook stood up. He did not come to me. He did not go to Marcello. He turned his blind head toward the far end of the dining room, toward the small servant's door that led into the old butler's pantry, and he began to walk. Slowly, steadily, with the same quiet purpose he had shown in the corridor outside the library. Marcello and I followed him without speaking. The captains followed us. Ottavia followed her son. Serafina, wiping her face, followed her mother. Rook led all of us into the butler's pantry, past the shelves of silver, past the wine racks, to a section of wood paneling that looked exactly like every other section of wood paneling in that house. He raised one heavy paw and scratched the wall. Dante pried the panel loose. Behind it, in a narrow service compartment nobody living in that house had opened in a generation, hung a single tailored coat. It was cedar-scented. It was clove-scented. It carried the same faint sharpness Rook had pulled at in the ballroom and in the library corridor, and against Salvatore's cashmere hem. It was also much smaller than Salvatore's coat. It had been tailored for someone slighter, younger. Marcello reached inside the collar and turned the lining out. Stitched into the silk was a small crest of a lion holding an olive branch, the Vieri family crest, sewn only into garments made for blood relatives of the direct line. Salvatore had never been a Vieri. Salvatore could not have worn this coat. Marcello looked at his mother. His mother's face did not change, which was in itself an answer. He looked at his sister. Serafina, still wet-faced, said in the smallest possible voice, "It isn't mine, Marcello. I swear on my son, it isn't mine." Rook pressed his blind muzzle against the fabric one more time and produced the same low, warning sound I had first heard from him on a champagne-soaked ballroom floor 2 months earlier. I understood then, and my stomach went cold. We had caught the man who had built the traps. We had not caught the person the traps had been protecting. Salvatore Corleone had spent 40 years earning Marcello's trust so that when he finally moved against him, he could move as an old man moves, slowly and forgivably. But someone younger, someone with Vieri blood in their veins, had walked into that house long before the champagne was ever poured. Someone Rook had smelled and never forgotten. Someone whose coat still hung in a pantry nobody remembered. Someone who had chosen, at the Copley Grand, to have that dog blinded a second time rather than risk the animal recognizing them across a crowded ballroom. Marcello turned the coat inside out very slowly and held the lining under the pantry light. There was a small dark spot on the inner sleeve where a fountain pen had once leaked, and above it, in fading ink, an initial had been embroidered into the silk in a child's uneven stitching, the sort of practice sampler an older sister might teach a much younger sibling to make. The letter was worn nearly smooth. Marcello ran his thumb across it and said nothing. Ottavia, behind him, made a small sound in her throat that was not surprise and not grief, but something that lived between the two. Serafina did not look at the coat. She looked at her mother, and her mother, for the first time that night, would not meet her daughter's eyes. Marcello did not speak for a long moment. Then he closed his fingers gently around mine, in front of his mother and his sister and his captains, and he said in the same quiet voice he had used to say, "Lock the doors." "Marla, you are not going home tomorrow." I did not say yes. I did not say no. I looked down at Rook, who had leaned his full weight against my leg and pressed his blind face into the coat of a stranger from his master's own bloodline. And I understood that the story I had walked into on a marble ballroom floor was not the story I was walking out of tonight. If you sat with us all the way to this pantry, do me one last favor before you go. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in one line who you think that second coat belongs to. Because whoever they are, they were in this house before I ever arrived, and they are still in this house tonight. I do not know their name yet, neither does Marcello, but Rook does, and Rook does not forget. The end. For now.